Theodicy, Encountering Evil by Dr. Christine. Hello class, this is me. I've been teaching at FIU in the Department of Religious Studies now since 1993, and ethics is my area of specialization. In many ways, theodicy is a monotheistic concern. Although everybody, all human beings, have to be concerned with the question of justice, because we all want to be treated justly. Nevertheless, in the Abrahamic religions, in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the theodicy issue, the question of how there can be evil in the world if God is both all good and all powerful, is a rather central one. And this is something that is rather unique about the Abrahamic religions. But if we think about it, it's not so difficult to understand why. If there are a number of different gods, if we believe the universe is people God, multiple gods, then, of course, those gods are plural. They don't all have the same needs, vision, desires. They will disagree. And therefore, in their disagreements, there may be room for evil. If there are no gods, evil can be accepted in the universe with no problem as part of just the nature of reality. It is really only with the positing of a single God, and especially a single God who is both good and powerful, that the theodicy question becomes so troubling. We're going to begin this presentation with the assumption that I hope we can all agree to, that evil does exist in our world. And because we all have some experience of the existence of evil, we ask, why is there evil? We often wonder, given the existence of evil and its persistence in our world, is it possible for there to ever be justice, for the innocent to ever be rewarded, and for the guilty to ever be sufficiently punished? How should we understand evil? We all know from our ordinary human experience that evil exists. We know not only the suffering that comes from natural disasters, from hurricanes and tornadoes, tsunamis, earthquakes, floods, and famines. We also recognize deliberate human evil that we read about in the news, as in the torture and murder of innocent people. Torture, terrorism, genocide, child molestation, slavery, and serial murders. These are only some of our evidence for evil in the world. Evil is also fostered in systems, in human systems, especially systems of poverty and oppression, systems that deny human rights. Racial segregation in the U.S., for example, or apartheid in South Africa, were two 20th century evil political systems. A more recent one might be the denial of education and mobility to girls under the Taliban government in Afghanistan. One of the clearest examples of systemic evil in our world is slavery, which, despite what many people think, survives in a number of different pockets throughout the world. As you see on the slide here, over 20 million children under the age of 10 work as carpet weavers, many of them sold by their families in Pakistan, India, Nepal, and other countries as well. These children are often crippled by the time they're 12 years old because they work under such terrible conditions for such long hours every day, their fingers become deformed and arthritic. In Sudan, hundreds of thousands of children have been taken into slavery when their families were killed, their villages attacked. A recent book by Mende Nazir, whose face you see here, tells of her escape from slavery in Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, after 12 years. Um, she only escaped because her family, the family that she was enslaved by, was so certain of the slave status and of her meekness that they took her to London with them, and in London she accidentally learned that slavery was not accepted in the rest of the world. Another example of slavery today is private armies across Africa, Asia, and parts of Latin America kidnap children and make them into soldiers, into young killers. But perhaps closer to our own country, there are trafficked adults and children from all over the world that are at work in sweatshops, on farms, and in commercial sex enterprises under conditions of slavery, where they're not allowed mobility, where they are not regularly paid, where they don't have their visas, their travel documents. And this is found in both developed nations like our own and in underdeveloped nations. So, how should we understand evil? Here are some of the most common ways that religious people have understood evil. One of the earliest ways understanding evil was as an essential part of the material world. We saw this in Gnosticism, in a number of Near Eastern sects like the Manichees. The understanding was that humans would only escape from evil when they escaped the material world. A second way, associated with Christianity since the time of St. Augustine, is original sin, the understanding that in Christianity that the sin of Adam and Eve has been passed on in human nature to each succeeding generation of humans, and that the guilt of this original sin of the fall of Adam and Eve makes us liable, makes us temptable to evil that we commit ourselves. There is an ongoing openness to evil in our nature. A third way, which we have found in various world religions, is to understand evil as a prelude to an apocalyptic reversal. That is, that people who experience evil, who are suffering great ills as communities, often understand that a new age is about to come with an apocalypse, with a tremendous upheaval that will reverse things. The evildoers will get what is coming to them, and the innocent sufferers will be rewarded. The Judaic messianic Son of Man figure was supposed to usher in such an apocalyptic reversal. In the late Middle Ages, at the very beginning of the Reformation, there were a number of sects amongst the Hussites, the Taborites, a number of different nomadic groups that preached apocalyptic reversals. As a test for worthiness of later reward, this is a part of this kind of theodicy is an important part of both Christian and Muslim theology, the understanding that this world is a kind of a test, and evil in particular, stuff that causes us to suffer when we suffer as innocents, is a test of whether or not we deserve to be with God in paradise. Sometimes that test is explicit and sometimes not. Next, evil is often understood as a punishment. That is, the difference between evil as a test for worthiness and evil as punishment has to do with whether or not we are guilty of evil. If we chose the evil, then evil that happens to us is understood as punishment for having chosen evil, for offending God. And if we suffer evil but were innocent of choosing it, then it is interpreted as a test. And lastly, in Hinduism and Buddhism, evil is not understood as something real. It is understood as an illusion which deludes humans and causes us to make very bad choices. And as we'll see, those bad choices have consequences. One of the more common depictions of evil in world religions is, when it is depicted at all, is the devil. The devil has many different names, some of them particular and some of them more generic, especially Satan and Shaitan are Christian and Jewish generic devils. But there are many different personal names. Iblis, for example, is a Muslim name for the devil, a personal leader of all the fallen angels. The most common understanding of the origin of devils is that they are fallen angels, angels who turned against God. Here we have the names of many of them. And we have many different images of devils. We're all familiar with devils that have horns and tails, but there are many other particulars. Here we have a 15th century, late 15th century image of the devil, and you can tell from looking at this image that the artist, like many other people of his day, considered that one of the most grievous sins, one of the most evil things that one could do, was to engage in sodomy. Human nature is often considered both good and evil, or perhaps more specifically as a battleground for good and evil. A number of ancient Middle Eastern religions taught of an initial and often ongoing battle between the good angels and those angels who had rebelled against God. And these bad fallen angels continue to create discord in creation by seducing humans into sin, into rebellion against God. Now, one of the interesting things that makes Judaism a little bit different here is that the Ha-Satan in the most common biblical story, Jewish biblical story, is actually not the perpetrator of evil himself, but a prosecutor figure who tests Job for God in order to find out if Job is truly faithful to God and should be rewarded as God proposes. In Eastern religions, in both Hinduism and Buddhism, evil is not so much an existent reality, but it is ignorance. It is a failure to understand reality, and an ability, a willingness to be taken in by illusion and to act on the basis of these illusions, delusions about oneself and the world. And the actions that we choose based on our delusions then create future suffering, both for us and in this world for others, through the action of karma. Here we have one of the most common understandings, simplistic understandings of evil, in this saying that encourages us to speak no evil, see no evil, hear no evil. But when we look at it, we have to understand that the assumption here is that evil is easily recognized, which is sometimes true, but sometimes not so true. Sometimes it's not true that even monkeys can recognize evil. Now we're going to look at 3 of the different categories of conceptions of evil that your textbook author, James Livingston, lifted up. But we're going to go beyond the textbook and examine some of the problems with these three theodicies. The first of the three is mystical participation, which you may remember is what Livingston calls it when one lives in a strongly tribal society that is relatively undifferentiated. That means that everyone in the tribe lives more or less the same life, the same occupation, the same religious roles. There's very little that differs in the lives of various members of the tribe. And this traditional way of life gets passed from one generation to another. So there's very little differentiation between generations either. And the way that this works for theodicy is that if someone wrongs you and causes you to suffer, and that someone belongs to the tribe then intervenes, punishes that person, requires them to make restitution to you. If someone from outside the tribe attacks you, does you an injustice in some way, again, the tribe will go after justice for you. And if unable to make justice for you, then will pursue justice for your descendants. For example, if you are killed, restitution will be made to your children, to your family. Now, one of the problems with mystical participation is that we increasingly do not live in this kind of society anymore. Our societies are increasingly specialized, and our sense of individuation has developed far beyond that is typical of mystical participation. So the question becomes, can we be satisfied with this kind of justice, that it may not be justice for me as an individual, but it is justice for my group? The second kind of theodicy here, this worldly theodicy, this means that if injustice is done me, that justice will be given to me or to my whole people, if my whole people are wronged, in this world, in this life, or at least a life very closely connected with this one. The assumption here is that there is some fairly quick intervention coming in this world that will defeat injustice, and make right what has been wrong. Now, one of the problems here is exactly this immediacy. We'll see this as we move on. The third type of theodicy is otherworldly theodicies. And this is the type that most of you are probably the most familiar with. The understanding that even if we suffer unduly in this world, and it seems as if evildoers prosper and are never punished for their misdeeds, that they will be in the next world, that justice will be achieved in the next world, that the innocent sufferers will be rewarded, and the guilty evildoers will be punished. One of the questions for this type of theodicy is whether or not people can continue to believe in it as they become exposed to more and more different models of religion, many of which do not have otherworldly theodicies, and scientific method, which inclines us to increasingly ask for proof before we believe. There are a number of problems with mystical participation today in the present age. One of them is that over the last few hundred years, associated largely with the period we call modernity, there has been a development in the sense of individual self. Now, this development is very closely related to specialization. We live in a society where individuals are expected to make myriad choices for themselves. They choose their education, what they're going to study. They choose their occupations. They choose their employers within that occupation. They choose where they will live, who they will marry, how many children they will have, if they will have children at all. They choose whether or not to marry. They choose their lifestyle. They choose their religious affiliation. They choose their friends, the people that they associate with in everyday life. And if we go back a few hundred years ago into more tribal, or even, not even tribal societies, but European societies, or some of the more specialized Asian societies that had moved away from tribalism, but were still very agricultural, we don't find humans making these kinds of individual choices. Until a few hundred years ago, most human beings inherited all of these things that identify us. The group decided where they would live, what they would do for a living, how they would be educated. There were no choices that came with that. There was no science to allow birth control, for example. In most societies, everyone was expected to marry, with the exception of a few religious figures. And when you married, the only way to prevent having children was to not have sex. So all of these things, everyone lived pretty much similar lives. And that meant that they did not have the same sense of individuality. Education was uniform for everyone. And so the ideas that they were exposed to were very, very similar. So there was very little grounds for developing individuality. In the modern age, we have shifted primarily from kin to voluntary associations. If we look at, for example, family celebrations like weddings, what we see is that while we still have family there, we also have our friends, our voluntary affiliations, the people that we work with, the people that we recreate with, the people that we live near. And many of these have taken the place of kin. If we look around us, we recognize that we are all very different, and that there are terrific differences in perspective, in occupation, in skills, in interests, in racial and ethnic backgrounds, in religion, just in the communities that live right around us. One of the other reasons that this mystical participation, this understanding that justice, that reward for good and punishment for evil is something that takes place within a community rather than for individuals, and over time rather than in one lifetime. One of the reasons we have difficulty with that is that we have different attitudes towards death, partly because death is understood as personal. It is my death, and my death is the death of myself. Because we don't have high levels of identification with the generations before us or after us. We understand ourselves as having distinct personalities from those generations. Therefore, death takes on a different meaning, and it becomes a greater obstacle to this mystical participation of each one in the larger community. One of the immediately recognizable difficulties with this world theodicies is that there has been a strong temptation for this worldly theodicies to predict a date, or at least a time, when the great reversal will take place, when all wrongs will be righted and all the evildoers will be punished. And Many of those dates have come and gone, and it's difficult to explain that failure in prediction away. A basic problem with this worldly theodicies is that they generally arrive out of times of great hardship and suffering, disasters, long-standing famines, social upheavals, revolutions, when many people want answers. They long for a fix, a historical fix. They want to believe that there is justice, that there is a God overlooking all who has a scheme of order and justice in mind. And so it becomes very easy to believe in this coming reversal, this coming revolution that will fix everything and reward the innocent and punish the guilty. But this needs to come quickly. Now, one of the questions about this kind of a theodicy is then, how does it deal with the times changing, when the times become more normal, when everyone, instead of suffering, becomes more prosperous? Do people retain this belief in the need or the expectation that that the Messiah will come, that the upheaval is going to be still just around the corner, another day, another week, but very soon? This becomes very problematic because the need for this figure is not so dramatic. And also, one of the difficulties that comes out of this is that today we have such increased knowledge of all the injustice, the violence, the pain, the suffering from all around the world. And we see all the different groups, not just our own group that has suffered, but all the different groups that have suffered. And that makes it hard to imagine what a global scheme of justice would look like. How do you give the land back, for example, to 3 or 4 different groups who claim it as their historic right based on occupation in different historical periods? So there are a number of difficulties with this worldly theodicies in terms of their endurance over time. There are a number of problems with otherworldly theodicies, too. One of the more common, here, the picture here is of the martyrdom of Hussein in Islam. Hussein was a grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. And amongst the Shia sect of Islam, the martyrdom of Hussein is a key central historical date, which has had a tremendous amount to do with the understanding that the Shia have of the way that humans should be in the world and the role of suffering in human life. The understanding is that suffering today allows one to participate in some small way in the suffering of Hussein, and to be rewarded with Hussein in Jannah, in heaven, eventually. Now, probably the most prominent critique of otherworldly theodicies is the Marxist critique. Marx noted that when religions teach that sufferings in this world will be rewarded in the next, they discourage the sufferers from revolution, from doing anything in this world to address the suffering, to end the suffering, and to establish justice. That is, they leave justice to God. And in so doing, Marx argues, religion supports exploitation and injustice rather than supporting its eradication. So he felt that religion is on the side of the oppressors. Now, a second problem with this otherworldly theodicy is actually the same as we noted with this worldly theodicies. It becomes difficult to describe jhana, or heaven, or even hell. How do we get a picture of what appropriate reward or appropriate punishment is for evildoers when we look at the many different types of evil, the many different reasons that people engage in evil, or even more difficult than hell is heaven. What is the appropriate reward for suffering? This is an image, one of many, many, many different Christian images of Judgment Day. Christianity is not the only religion that believes that Judgment Day will arrive, but the many sects of Christianity are the most prominent in producing visual images of this Judgment Day. Here we see that at the very top of the picture we have the bottom of God's throne. It only says Adonai. We see God's feet, but not God's body. And underneath, at God's feet, we have Jesus, presumably with Mary by his side, pronouncing judgment. And we see at the bottom, we see the image of hell, and those being cast down to hell. As we saw above, one of the ways of understanding evil is as illusion, and this is typical of the East, of what your author calls karma samsara theodicies. In both Hinduism and Buddhism, the understanding is that hell is, more or less, the condition of samsara. It is our placement on the wheel of life, the wheel of rebirth, of birth, death, and rebirth, so that it is our inability to escape from existence, which is in fact the sentence of condemnation. And salvation is escape from the suffering that accompanies human life. Now, so samsara is the wheel of life to which we are all initially condemned, and karma is the law of retribution. Karma says that what goes around comes around. For the good deeds that you do, you will be rewarded. For the evil that you do, you will be punished. But the further understanding is that we do not really choose evil out of a desire for evil. We choose evil because we think we're choosing the good, but we are misled by illusions about who we are, about the existence of an independent self, illusions about the nature of the world and what's important and what's not important in the world. So we make choices based on illusions, and those choices have consequences, evil consequences. And we must live out the evil consequences of those choices based on illusion. Now, this is interesting because in this schema, this is why this is called the most rational of all the schemas, thus justice is built into the nature of the universe. It is not something that requires an external judge at the end of time. It is something that is built into the nature of the universe. The law of karma is part of the law of existence. Now, just because it is the most rational of all the systems doesn't mean that we can't find problems with it. One of the perversions of this system, not actually necessary within it, but very common, is that those who suffer, those who are born crippled or abused by their spouses or abandoned or who suffer other fates are assumed to be guilty either of evil in this life or in a past life, because the rationale is that it is your karma. You're living out your karma. So if your life is prosperous and pleasant, then you're being rewarded for good deeds in the past. If your life is horrible, you're being punished for your deeds in the past. That means that there's little notion of innocent suffering, even in children, because even when children suffer, it is assumed that they are suffering because of bad deeds in a past life. So that unless you can point to and frequently, even if you can point to another person who is causing you this evil, the assumption is that you yourself are responsible. This makes the idea of morality much less important in morality in terms of acting for others. Action for justice is not nearly so central within the theological traditions of the East as in the theological traditions of the West. There is more of a belief in the system, in the organization, as we saw with karma. It's believed that justice is built into the nature of the universe and therefore does not require human intervention. In its Hindu aspects in particular, dharma is often understood that one is called to do one's dharma, to fulfill one's duty, and in fulfilling one's duty, one earns good karma. And dharma is often understood as duty towards one's family and one's level of society, one's caste, for example, in Hinduism. So it is fulfilling social expectations that is one's dharma and that earns good karma. So this kind of understanding creates real stability in social systems. It reduces the expectation that humans have to intervene in society to create justice. And to a certain extent, it discourages social reform. And yet, it is necessary to say that despite this, what we might think of as the inevitable results of such a system of thinking about justice, and the karma system, both Hinduism and Buddhism have been, certainly in the last century or so, increasingly involved in social reform movements. In Hinduism, the movement to get rid of the untouchables, to get rid of the caste system, has been widespread and moved into law even. Accompanied by improvements in the status of women and the legal rights of women in Hinduism. And in Buddhism, in the last 40-some-odd years, there has been a strong movement in the direction of socially involved Buddhism, that is, taking responsibility for various kinds of social injustices, getting involved in world-improving movements, particularly around nonviolence, but broader than that, based on compassion. One of the major differences between Eastern and Western religions concerning evil is the way that it is understood, the way that it is depicted. Obviously, you see the differences between this feminine, beautiful figure of Maya, the Eastern representation of not exactly evil, but about as close as we can get, and the devil in Abrahamic traditions. The difference is a matter of directness. and activity, really. In the Western religions, evil is personified as an active force, a person who wills evil and tries to persuade others, to enlist others in his evil cause. In Eastern religions, evil is understood as a kind of consequence of people being deluded, of their following an illusion, they're being deceived. And that deception is personified by the figure of this beautiful woman, Maya. Maya tempted Buddha himself as he sat meditating under the Bo tree, and Maya is held responsible for the terribly destructive choices that many human beings have made because they saw reality as they wanted it to be rather than as the way it actually was, and therefore made very bad choices with hurtful consequences that cause suffering for others and often for themselves. Now, it's important to remember this indirection, this idea that evil is not a real presence, because in a sense, while it's difficult to know how to defeat evil, you notice that in the Western traditions, human beings can resist the devil, but they don't actually vanquish the devil. This is something that one needs a divine figure, a savior figure to do. Whereas in the Eastern tradition, all that it requires to defeat evil is for humans to see the world as it actually is, as illusion. They only need to understand the reality of human existence. One of the most common responses to the experience of suffering in human communities from time immemorial and still today is that believers insist that suffering is God's test. God is testing us to see whether we are ready for salvation, ready for heaven, worthy of heaven. That's the understanding, that suffering is a test. And if we deal with it well, we will be saved. And if we don't, then we don't have the strength of virtue. Now, the biggest problem with that understanding is that our experience of human suffering is that a great deal of suffering is gratuitous. That is, it is not earned. It is not deserved by the people who create it. Often it falls, the consequences of evil acts fall not on the doer of the act, but on innocent victims. And thus, God seems arbitrary. Is it just, some people ask, that God would inflict suffering on some in order to test others, or even to allow others to inflict suffering on the innocent as a part of their test? One response to that comes from theologian John Hicks, and he argues that it is not a matter of God saying, for example, as the devil set it up for Job, of God saying, well, let's test our believer Job here and give him boils and kill all his children and take away all his money and leave him sitting on a manure pile and see if he still has faith. It's not, he says, that's not really the way it is. That story is an analogy. And Hicks says that the process of human life, and he does understand it as a process, is a matter of developing virtue, and that one of the chief ways that we develop virtue is in response to suffering. All different kinds of suffering, not just the suffering that comes with physical pain or disability, but the suffering that comes from not being able to achieve everything we would like to achieve, not having all the abilities we would like to have, not being always loved by the people that we want to love us. There are innumerable kinds of suffering at all stages of our lives. And for most of us, those moments of suffering are balanced by, we learn to balance them with moments of joy, of thanksgiving, of appreciation, of contentment. But Hicks says that we need suffering in our lives. For sometimes moments of suffering are what spur us on to achievement, to pride, to feelings of self-worth. If we didn't experience suffering, he says, how could we possibly be open to compassion for the sufferings of others? We have to suffer ourselves and recognize our own suffering before we can respond to the sufferings of others. Then his conclusion is that evil and human suffering are not caused by God. God does not create them in order to torture us to see if we respond well, but rather God allows them as a necessary part of our growth and development. Now, that answer, too, is not without its critics. The critics would say, well, that doesn't really absolve God. So God doesn't actively create evil or suffering or direct them to afflict individual human beings. Still, he allows it. And isn't that just as bad? Isn't it just as bad to stand there and do nothing when a child is about to fall off the end of the dock into the lake and drown as to push the child off? If the result is the same and the predictability is the same, what's the real difference there? So there are some open questions even about Hicks' answer. Process theology is one of the more popular modern responses to the theodicy question. For process theology, everything is in flux, and everyone is in relationship. And relationship changes everything, which is why everything is in flux. The understanding here is that not only are human beings in relationship with many other human beings, but human beings are in relationship with God. And that just as our relationships change us over time, so God's relationships with human beings make a difference to God, that God changes too. God is also in flux. Because of these changes, because we influence God, we are not powerless. And because we influence God, God is not totally in charge. This is what creation meant, according to process theologians. That God created creatures to be in connection with, in relationship with, and that meant that there is a certain small amount of contingency in God, because he gave these creatures with whom he wants to be in relationship their own free will. Because God is not totally in control, God cannot be held responsible for everything that happens, as some things that God wishes would happen become frustrated by the evil that human beings choose. Now, totally differently, but in a related way, theologies from below, from oppressed communities, black theology, for example. Um, Theologies from below have tended to approach this question not so much from a philosophical perspective like process theology, but from a very experiential direction. They say our experience in the world is that of powerlessness, individual powerlessness and community powerlessness. And our belief in God, our reliance on God is total. If it were not for the power of God, we could have no hope for the future. All hope of emancipation, all hope of truly becoming human beings in every sense of the word depends upon God's action in the world on our behalf. Therefore, for us, God must be all-powerful. So there you have a kind of a critique, a contradiction of the God of limited power in process theodicy. Another, and one of the final theodicies we'll look at, is a theodicy of protest. And the theodicy of protest has, we might say, one of the prime figures in a theodicy of protest would be the Jewish Holocaust writer Elie Wiesel. And this is in many ways a very Jewish concept, although it's not limited to Jews. The theodicy of protest insists that yes, God is good, and yes, God is powerful, all-powerful. And we cannot decide an answer to the theodicy question. We can't know. None of the answers are satisfactory. We have to recognize that none of them are satisfactory. And so what we do is we protest against God. We say, when we see the innocent suffering, we say, where are you, God? Why don't you do something about this? Fix it. How can you just be in the face of such suffering? So they protest against God. They rail against God, believing in God, believing in the goodness of God, that God would never countenance the suffering of the innocent. And yet, they can't understand what is going on. These are some of the major theodicies and criticisms of these theodicies from religions around the world. It's important to recognize that Al-Ghazali is on target when he said centuries ago that none of these are fully satisfactory. There is no answer that settles the question of how God can be good and powerful, and yet the innocent suffer. But in fact, as many theologians have pointed out, if there were an answer, if it was settled, then that would be a way that we could accept, in some ways, the suffering of the innocent. And we should not accept the suffering of the innocent. It's one thing to say, as we see here, believers are content to leave some issues as mysteries. Yes, the answer to this question is clearly beyond our experience, and we do need to leave room for some mysteries in the world. But one of the things that is important about this particular mystery is that it leaves us to continue to ask the question, to look at the suffering of the innocent, and to recognize how wrong it is that innocents suffer.